for showing the dependencies between actors and the connections between institutions, as well as discussing with you how can this method be further improved, what are the things that you see for future work, etc. Just to clarify the difference between climate mitigation and climate adaptation real quick. So where in climate mitigation, we try to reduce the negative impact that we have on the climate itself. So by reducing our carbon emissions, for example, in the domain of climate adaptation, we basically acknowledge that we're already experiencing some impacts due to the changing climates. You mentioned some of them at the beginning, but it can be heavy rainfall, droughts, more heat waves, as we've also seen in the United States last year in Portland, for example. So it's really about adjustments in natural or human systems in response to like actual or expected climate stimuli. So these can be physical, but also non-physical interventions and measures. And this domain to me was very interesting because it's a very complex domain, so to say. So what definitely characterizes it is the polycentricity. You don't have like a central entity who's responsible for climate action or climate adaptation. In the Netherlands, there is a national strategy for climate adaptation, and all governments need to have a strategy for this. They need to revise the strategy, and the goal is to be climate adaptive in 2050. But it's not just the local government, for example, or a municipality who's responsible for this. You have different ownership in a municipality itself. So you have different owners of within the built environment. You have different transport infrastructure owners, and all of them need to cooperate and need each other also in order to adapt infrastructure, the built environments, and also sectors themselves, so to say. And what makes this more complex is that there's no fixed definition of what it is or what it means to be climate adaptive. So the Netherlands has said, yes, we want to be climate adaptive by 2050, but what being climate adaptive means depends on what you define it to be, basically, or what your ambition is. It depends on what climate risks you don't find acceptable or you want to tackle as a government, and the way you want to. So, of course, there are different research programs in the Netherlands in which, the results show, okay, areas might be more prone to certain climate risks if these and these conditions apply. But again, it is you as an entity or an organization who has to decide, do I want to tackle them, yes or no? What does it mean to be climate adaptive? And it's also interesting because the Netherlands has a very long history of flood risk management, for example. You could say that that is a way of adapting to your environment, but there are also situations that were unprecedented here before. So the temperature hitting 40 degrees Celsius, for example, the heat waves, the periods of drought never occurred here, for example. Just last month, I mean, I was talking about the cold here in the Netherlands, but last March was actually one of the driest Marches that we've ever had here. So you have to adapt to situations that were unprecedented, which means that new institutions will emerge. They will change over time because it's also a learning experience, so to say. It's like adaptation is not a cycle where you start and it has some kind of an ending point, but you constantly have to adapt to new information and to new circumstances, because climate change is also very unpredictable phenomenon. You don't know exactly how the climate will change or what impacts will happen. So what then also makes it challenging to address this complexity is that if you look at policy documents, there's a lot of text, there's a lot of information that you would have to go through. And while they can give you information about the measures that, for example, a government wants to take in the future because of certain climate risks, it's difficult to see the whole picture or how that government or entity interacts with other stakeholders. That's not something you can just get to know exactly from like a strategy document, for example. And what's also interesting is the role of informal institutions. So you can have rules and form, but then the way in which the government or a specific actor actually interacts in practice is different, and you don't immediately get to know this from written documents. So we wanted to basically systematically map out and visualize connections and dependencies between institutions. So we wanted to take these individual institutions, the actors that are depending on these institutions, and to see how they are connected to each other, how actors interact with each other. And the domain of climate adaptation seemed like a very interesting one, a very relevant one to use this in. And in my master's thesis, I chose transport infrastructures in the Port of Rotterdam, because I thought of the port to be a nice place where all these infrastructures, so to say, like interconnect. Like you have the railways, you also have the roads, you have pipelines, you have waterways. So it was, in an ideal situation, you would see all these stakeholders working together on climate adaptation. That was the idea in which I started this research. So that was the context and the goal basically that we had. And eventually we came up with the institutional network analysis approach, and I will mostly focus on the data collection and the coding and clustering of the data. And then Amineh will also go more in depth about the network diagrams basically that we made and what you can derive from them. And thus this method basically, like, it combines the institutional grammar, the institutional analysis and development framework, and social network. And you will see elements of these throughout the entire presentation. So when I started my research, I first looked at, okay, what is there about climate adaptation in the Netherlands? Along what lines can I start the data collection? This slide is in Dutch, but there are basically 3 phases in 2020 that local governments and also higher level governments were focusing on for climate adaptation. The first one is basically mapping your vulnerabilities. So through modeling, you make a very first screening basically of what vulnerabilities there are in a specific area, in a province, in a municipality. And these analyses are made for rainfall, but also drought, heat waves, and flooding. These are the 4 larger categories of impact that are that the Netherlands studies basically. Based on those, you conduct risk dialogues in which you decide on, okay, which risks do you find so unacceptable that we want to tackle them? And the third one is that you write an implementation program for it. So you decide on the measures that you want to take, whether you want to take them on the short term and long term, etc. So for the desk research, I looked along these phases and looked, we first conducted the desk research by looking at publicly available sources. So the Netherlands has like a standardized guide on how to make the stress tests or those models to map the vulnerabilities, for example. There are guides which gives you norms on, or basically like some kind of instructions, but very abstract instructions on how to conduct these risk dialogues. And you can conduct these risk dialogues as a government, but also as an entity like the Port of Rotterdam with other stakeholders. But basically, you had those guides there, and also guides on how to draw up an implementation agenda. So these were the written institutions, and different researchers had basically in other publications outlined how they coded them. But there were no publications that actually showed how you can code them from interviews. And these interviews, we wanted to conduct them because we thought it would be very relevant to get to know more about the rules in use prior to those rules that you might read about in the documents. So we conducted semi-structured interviews. And when we selected respondents, we wanted to really approach people who were either involved in climate adaptation or who were using the infrastructures or owning the infrastructures connected to the Port of Rotterdam, and look along that line basically. And I did my master thesis also in a company, was another Dutch consultancy firm, and the contact information from the respondents was either retrieved from people working there who knew them, for example, or on the internet when looking along lines of climate adaptation, or just looking online basically. And we approached about 29 respondents, and some of them referred to a colleague, and they said, okay, he or she knows more about this domain. And in the end, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 9 organizations. These were governmental agencies who owned infrastructures, but they were also experts like the Royal Meteorological Institute, who provide the scenarios with which these infrastructure owners make those models to map their vulnerabilities, for example. And we did them in a semi-structured way. So with the people at that consultancy firm, I also discussed what questions we could ask to get a better idea of the interactions during the knowledge gathering phase, a risk dialogue, and drafting an implementation agenda. But we also kind of left the interviews open because this is a pretty new domain also in the Netherlands. And we wanted the people who were interviewing also to, maybe give other directions that we did not know about yet during the interview. So we kept them semi-structured, but we had these questions just in mind. And after the interviews, the data coding and clustering started. And like I said, these phases of knowledge gathering, conducting the risk dialogue, and the implementation agenda were basically the action arenas along which we looked for the information, and also the lines along which we coded the institutions. And I used Atlas DI to code the institutions. In the program, you can just basically mark parts of your text and write along, for example, what action arena this might be a part of, or what this is about, basically. And there were different kind of topics that I derived from the data. They were about the risks, so that gives information about what climate risks the infrastructure owner is focusing on, for example, rules and guidelines that they have to comply to or they following because of climate adaptation, the measures, so that gives an impression, or it gives you information about, okay, what are the measures that then they want to implement, basically. And also the links, for example, and cooperation between stakeholders. So I use this to kind of just structure the information, and also to get a better idea of, okay, along what lines do I have institutions, on what topics can I code them for these action arenas that I had defined before. And I basically wrote down the steps that I conducted when coding these institutions. So there were already research, like I said, who had written down how they coded them for documents, but there was not a guide yet for, okay, what steps can you follow to code them from interview reports, for example. And these were just the steps that I followed in my thesis. I also wrote examples of how I, for example, marked the verbs, and how I came from a specific sentence to a rule, norm, or strategy. And in the end, I coded a total of 6 rules, 16 norms, and mostly strategies, actually, as institutional statements, which shows, first of all, that this field is very new. The rules on, for example, how to exactly map your vulnerabilities, or conduct your risk dialogues are not very formally written. So it might differ from one situation to another, how these dialogues are conducted, for example, or what information is mapped about the vulnerabilities. And yeah, so in this way I coded the information, and I found it challenging because during this time, a lot of stakeholders were still in the phase of mapping the vulnerability. So they had discussed, or they had certain risk dialogues that they had conducted, but I wasn't sure whether this was the approach, or when the actors were like not that far yet. And when there is definitely like some kind of an institutional void, it makes it harder to code these statements. So I think that was definitely difficult. And of course, coding institutions in this way makes it prone to individual bias. So reading the interviews, you might interpret it in a certain way, but the person you interviewed might have meant something else. So these are things that we have to consider when coding it. But I think coding it in this way with the institutional grammar definitely was helpful to distinguish between these rules, norms, and strategies, and also to see, okay, what kind of a domain are we talking about? And I think climate adaptation in this respect had very few rules and norms, and it was more about strategies and how the actors were just interacting in a domain that was pretty new for them. So that was it for my part. I think, Amineh, you can take over from here.
Thanks, Batoul. Let me see if I have, yeah, it seems to be working. Let me go to the next slide.
Should we quickly check in and see if anybody has any questions?
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions so far that they wanted to get off their chest? Okay, all right, I would say go on. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to follow what Batoul was describing and just focus on the network analysis part. So basically, we tried to, I've been trying to do this for a couple of years now, so this wasn't the first effort, but the idea was to try to visualize the institutional connections by using the IG and the network idea of connecting different statements together. So what you see here is actually the representation of a single institutional statement in a network diagram. The A is the rectangle, and it's using IG 2.0, by the way. So the hexagons are the context. So either you could use this. You don't see my mouse, do you, or not? Let me just.
Yes, you can see the mouse. You can see the mouse.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, so you could have them separately like this, or just use the context or the condition if you're using the original IG as the condition. And the object is the outcome of the institution, and the deontic connects the attributes, and the aim connects the condition to the object. So that's just one statement. And the way you connect different institutional statements together is by these dotted arrows. So the object of one institutional statement is connected to the activation condition or the context of another institutional statement in the network. And we have one more representation, and that's the or else. So when we have an or else statement, the attribute who does not follow the rule is connected to something like this, where the condition will always be if not, and there will be an attribute here. So for example, the policeman doing something, fining the person who didn't comply with the rule. So this is all like the basis of the diagram. And then we just try to connect the different IG statements that were coded in the previous step to into a network. So for the phases that Batoul was talking about, we defined different action arenas. So per phase, there were 3 phases. We had different diagrams. This one is the risk dialogue phase. And you see the network. So basically all the institutions connect, all the institutional statements connected together within the risk dialogue phase. So if you just look at the conditions, you will see how many institutions there are. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 institutions on this diagram. There's actually more because these 3 are merged. And you could have composite actors. Sometimes it happens that you have more than one actor following a rule together. So this is the risk dialogue participants have to do certain thing. And the dotted lines, again, are the connection between the different statements. And you will also see 3 stars here that I will go into more detail now. So I'm just going to focus on this part of this network diagram because that's where the interesting stuff comes into place. so what you see here is that, so the message is that there's an issue, there's an institutional concern, as we call it in this part of the diagram, meaning that these actors are doing two things. So two institutions where the actors are the same, the condition is the same, the aim is the same, but the objects are different. And when you see such thing, it means that, okay, there's an issue. There are two rules addressing the same thing, and something seems to be happening here. And in this case, I call it a conflict, but you could call it anything else, is that the use of risk assessment criteria is the problem, because the parties build a shared decision framework, which everybody else, the participants, must follow for risk assessment. But apparently, if you go to these different organizations, they actually have their own risk matrices, and they tend to follow that. So the rule within the ProRail organization, for example, says that even if there's a shared decision-making framework, you have to use the ProRail risk matrix, while in the risk dialogue phase, all the participants had agreed to follow the shared decision-making framework. If it's there, if it's already agreed on. So you see here that there's a conflict situation. So the organization doesn't really know where to follow and what to follow. And you see it for all the other organizations as well. So the BRZO companies and the RWS, so the road. And this company is for carrying chemical hazards, if I'm not mistaken. So all of them actually do the same thing. So it seems that they're just used to having these risk matrices and using those for climate adaptation strategies, while this shared decision framework also exists, and it's kind of expected to be followed. And the color code actually shows that they're both rules. So they're not shared strategies or anything. They're both rules, but coming from different actors. And this part, if you're wondering where this object comes from, came from the other parts of the diagram, which I did not include in this figure. And the nice thing about these diagrams is that identifying institutional concerns is actually quite straightforward. So there are two ways in which you can identify institutional concerns. It's either a situation where the two statements are completely identical except for the aim, or a situation where the two statements are identical except for the object. And this is just like by experience and drawing many diagrams and trying to put many statements together that we came to this conclusion. And yeah, by identifying these points of concern, you could actually better get a better picture of the institutional landscape. And another result it was again, we call it institutional void, but you could call it anything you want. So that's just the name we give it. It's an institutional concern again. This time differences in aims, not objects. The previous time was differences in objects between two institutions. This time, this is an example of same object, but different aims. And basically what this says is that when investment is required on a certain point where infrastructures overlap, it's not really clear who should take the financial responsibility. So that's just the message that this part of the diagram is giving. So ProRail is the railway company, should, if expansion of water storage areas is needed, finance project costs. This is a norm because it's green. But ProRail does not finance it because the rule says so. So in their company, they say, oh, we're not supposed to be financing this situation. So, it's just showcasing what's out there and trying to pinpoint the points where there could be concerns that we have to take into consideration. And another added value of the network approach is that we could also have metrics to get a more quantitative image of, the institutional landscape, both in terms of actors, but also other components of the IG. So for example, for each one of these, I haven't put the definition here, how you measure it, but that's also, if you look at the paper, you'll find out how that can be done. So centrality is really about the attributes, and we measure the out degree of each attribute in a network diagram to see how important an actor is, to identify potential bottlenecks. So for example, is there this actor who has to sign off everything, in bureaucratic situations that you can just pinpoint by counting these out degree connections. And embeddedness, on the other hand, is about the object, and basically the same thing. So measuring how embedded an object is, meaning that many other institutions would only be triggered if this object is created and is there. So, for example, we see quite often that contracts are the objects that are quite embedded in the institutional situation. So many things will only take place if there's a contract in place that is created for another institutional setting. The density shows how connected the different institutions are. So I call it the institutional dependency index. And it basically, you know, measures the dotted lines. Not really measures the dotted lines. So there's a formula for it, but it looks at the dotted lines between the different institutions in a diagram to see how, to see whether there's a rather swift institutional landscape where everything seems to be in place. It's kind of waterfall, things are not that connected, people seem to be following the rules smoothly, or a place where there are many connections and dependencies. Therefore, you know, there could be potential bottlenecks and potential objects that are quite central and need to be there for things to run smoothly. And finally, we have the institutional conformance index. So if this is measured and is above 1, it shows that there's a conformance issue. So people following a rule is there, but people are not conforming to the rule. This was not part of the analysis in this research. So we didn't have any conformance issues in the adaptation case study. But in cases where there are actual people, individuals doing stuff, then you see more of these conformance issues, which was another paper that Saba and I have written and is under review. So what did the metric analysis add to the network issues that I previously pinpointed? So what we actually came to realize is that, yes, it's true that there's, sorry for the background noise, it's true that there's a shared framework and the individual companies and organizations are actually following their own matrices. But in the end, if we just calculate the embeddedness of the objects, we get into this source where all the matrices and shared frameworks are actually measured or built based on. So the risk and the source of risk analysis is actually the same. So in the end, it doesn't really create a big problem for climate adaptation efforts, but there is a bit of inconsistency because nobody knows whether they should follow the shared decision framework or their own matrices. So that's something that we realized by calculating the metrics, in this case, the object embeddedness. And then we also saw that there is a high dependency between institutions in the risk dialogue phase. And something that was actually revealed was that the infrastructure owners, ProRail and RWS, so the railway and the roadway, were actually way more important and central in the whole adaptation landscape than the regional government bodies, such as the Port of Rotterdam, which was interesting because, you know, it seemed that the initiatives and the adaptation strategies were actually coming from the government and not these individual organizations. So we provided a lot of policy recommendations based on our findings, such as constructing a common framework which contains all the KPIs, just to better embed in all the organizations is really needed, so that people know that, okay, this is the thing that we have to follow because it addresses all our criteria and KPIs. And also the formal clarification of responsibilities where infrastructures overlap. And also including the infrastructure owners in the decision making, because they are actually central and they're the ones who could carry out stuff, as our matrices showed. So that's my final slide. So just reflecting on the network analysis approach, we see it as a visualization tool to give us a better picture of the institutional landscape, their connections, and potential issues that may arise because institutions are not in isolation and they're actually related to each other in different ways. I have developed, or I have a software developer who has developed a software to create diagrams from IG coded data. So if you have an Excel sheet, you could actually get the diagram automatically built, and then you have to just make the connections between them, because that kind of still needs some interpretation by the person who's making the connections between objects and conditions. And yeah, like all the other IG research, coding really influences the final outcome. And in this case, the network metrics especially are highly influenced by the way we code our data. And something else that also needs a bit of effort to do is the definition of action situations. So for Batoul's case, it was relatively easy because we had this diagram where the different phases of climate adaptation were mapped out, and we just chose those as the action situations to draw the diagrams separately. But in cases where we're not lucky enough to have these mapped out phases, then it's more difficult to see how to divide the action situations so that the networks per action situation are comprehensive enough and informative enough. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And we would be happy to receive any comments, recommendations, suggestions, and questions.
Thank you so much. That was really very interesting. Lots to unpack there. Any questions from the audience? Nobody? Batoul, could you stop screen sharing?
Yeah, one moment.
I see no questions in the chat. Oh, there you go, Tommy.
Great, thank you, Ute, and thank you, Batoul and Amineh, for the presentation. It's really interesting and fascinating how you've managed to incorporate pretty much every element from IG 2.0 into a network visualization, which I think it's really challenging, and it's amazing what you've done. So kudos for that. My question, I just got a little bit stuck on one of the last comments you made, Amineh, about how coding influences the outcomes of these networks, right? And it strikes me that in these visual, at least in the ones that the visualizations that you've all shown, objects are always inanimate, right? So I wonder if you have had to deal with a situation where you had an animate object, right? And how does that look in a network? Because it seems like, at least in your cases, it was pretty straightforward that all of the animate elements or things were attributes, and that's awesome. But how do you deal then when you have situations where a rule tells an animate actor to do something to another animate actor, right? Does that play a role in your calculations, and how do you take into consideration? Because I'm thinking, like, how can I apply your approach to my research, for instance, right? And where I have a lot of those instances where rules tell people to do things to other people or other organizations. And then, what was the other thing I had? Oh, and then I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on one thing you said early on, where you define the objects of an institutional statement as the outcome of those statements. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about the reasoning behind considering objects as outcomes of a statement.
Oh, excellent questions, Tommy. So you pinpointed on the exact right thing that I wanted to further develop. So well done for that. So before I had, before seeing the object, so before seeing Saba's work, let's put it that way. So I used to use the original IG without the object, and I was already working on this network diagrams. And at that point, I kind of just defined an outcome, because that seemed to be the thing that is missing from the IG components. And then once we found the object component, we said, oh, that seems to be kind of the same thing most of the time. And indeed, so far it's always been inanimate. That's why the connections between the arms, as we call them, so the the institutions in the diagram are always between the condition and the object, because the object is always inanimate. I can imagine, I've actually been looking for a case to study that, because so far it hasn't happened to the 5 cases that I've had so far. That if the object is animate, then we could actually connect different attributes together. But that's just my general gut feeling of how this would develop further. Yeah, and I think that addresses your second question as well, right, about objects and outcomes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Because maybe if I can add to that, because the way, maybe I can just share my screen real quickly. Because the way, like, I don't know if you can read it exactly, but you have here like 2 institutional statements connected to each other, basically. And the way that they are connected right now, like you said, is that you have this inanimate object, basically, and it kind of like triggers the condition under which another actor will conduct another institutional statement. So the way they're connected now is that, like, the inanimate object, or you will code them in a way that the inanimate object of one statement triggers the condition so that another institutional statement can take place. That's the way they're connected now, but it would, like Amineh said, be very interesting to see if you can redraw them or draw these networks in a way in which the object would actually be animate. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Michael?
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation, and I am going to have to look carefully at the paper. These networks look fascinating. Over the years, I've reviewed several papers dealing with the institutional grammar, and I've almost always made comments about how, yeah, looking at one statement is nice. That's great. I understand how hard that is. That's great. But boy, it would really be nice to see how these fit together into a network of some kind. And so I really want to encourage you to continue working in this direction. This is clearly an important step in moving in that direction. So great. I was made a little uncomfortable by one of your last statements about how difficult it is to identify what the action situation is in your networks. And I've actually been wrestling with that a bit myself, because the action situation is kind of at the core of everything I've tried to do over the years. And it's hard for me to identify exactly what it is, what it outputs, how they're connected. They can be connected in so many different ways. It's kind of difficult. I hadn't really thought about a direct connection between the action situation definition and the institutional grammar definition. I'm going to have to think a little more carefully about that. I know it's not a simple connection. I remember having some discussions with Lynn about, could you do a formal organization as an action situation? And she'd say, well, there are probably a lot of different action situations within any kind of formal organization. It's kind of where organizational charts come from and stuff like that. So that didn't help me very much either. But this getting at the fundamental questions here of how do you build a representation of how these institutions are connected into some sort of structure and then some sort of process. And that's the last point I want to make here. It's not really a question, it's sort of a comment. I'm having trouble seeing how you would animate these networks, how a policy question would sort of go through the structure, how a policy issue, a confrontation, a conflict of some kind enters into it, a dispute enters into the structure and then goes through this structure and then outputs out into something else and then into some other sort of policy situation later on. If you can think about or find a way to represent how a particular line of discussion or a particular controversy that is examined in different research, different discussion forums or whatever, and how it goes, a statement is drafted and then goes to a committee and then goes to sort of a conference committee with bigger groups and then gets appealed. Now, some sort of a sequence of these as sort of the next step. And I'm just curious if you've been thinking along those lines at all. But great work. This is really cool.
So I'll respond to this shortly, and then I'll give Saba wants to say something, and I think Batoul has a good example of what you were describing,
Good.
Michael. So, Saba, do you want to go before me?
No. You from
okay.
Please.
Yeah. So first of all, excellent question, Michael. Indeed, it's related to the action situations and the way we define them. We have connected the action situations together. I think also in Batoul's case, right? We've connected them. So we have like an object being created in one action situation, which is carried out to the other action situations. And there's actually a cycle, a common thread between them. Maybe in my other cases, it's more clear. But the thing about defining action situations is that if they are chosen in a smart way, then the network just has provides a much more clear picture of what's happening within the action situation than when it's vaguely defined. So that's the part that I find challenging, especially for cases where there's no theoretical phase definition, if you want to call it. So, for example, for flood risk management, which is another case that I looked at, there were clear action situations, and that was also useful. But for other cases, not. So, first of all, yes, we are looking into. We have other cases that the action situations are connected to each other, and we do see that the object created in one action situation actually influences other action situations. So yeah, that's definitely there, and it's nice to see the thread across the action situations through this. Yeah,
Great.
Batoul, do you want to give an example of this? Do you remember an example in your network diagrams?
I have to look for the example, so maybe Saba can like ask her question while I look for the example for my feed.
Well, I found Mike's comments really interesting, and I think, it made me think this is one of the challenges of just looking at institutions in form, because essentially, I think that the way I interpreted your comment, Mike, is that fundamentally in connecting these institutional statements, you want to see, what sort of interaction on these different objects with these varying levels of constraint, like what are the possible outcomes that can emerge, and being able to understand the possible outcomes may actually help put the boundaries on what the action situation is, because it is a way to constrain it. But this is when we're just looking at the institutions in form, you don't have that possibility of outcome that would emerge in behavior, if you will. So it seems it seems like there's a different challenge, I think, with trying to map this in just the rules on how people are supposed to behave.
And by the way, a starting point for me, Michael, was the networks of action situations. So I also looked at that.
I recognized it. Yeah, I recognized it. That's great.
Aaron has his hand up. Sorry, and he had his hand up before, but really quick, and sorry, just follow up on Saba, but wouldn't that, this distinction between formal and informal, wouldn't that almost ask for looking at a network analysis of the formal rules and comparing it to the rules in form? I know that sounds like double the work, but to compare how the outcomes, because there are theoretical outcomes of formal rule structures, right? Am I misunderstanding you, Saba? Yeah.
Ideally, if you can get the structure put together. Yeah.
Right. And then looking at how that actually plays out in the real world. So in the informal rules, so that would almost demand doing this in two sequences. So the formal rules, mapping them on a network, and then the informal rules.
Right, because I sense, when we're studying like, applying the IAD in the institutions and use realm, it's almost like, well, looking at what are what is it called? How we problematize it is the situation is by looking at the outcomes and seeing, right, like doing some sort of evaluative assessment of the outcomes that emerged from interactions among actors within an action situation. But and then backtrack to see, is there something about the institutional design that contributes to that problem? But in this case, you're putting, you're going the other way. You're spending the time like defining the rules that are governing the action situation. And then, as you said, sort of mapping it to these theoretical outcomes.
Right.
Which is
Yeah.
a different exercise.
So there might actually be different action situations. There might be formal action situations and informal action
Well,
situations.
that's exactly
Yeah.
where my mind was going with that. Is that I mean, I wonder if there's something about conceiving of action situations on paper that's qualitatively distinctive from the conceiving of action situations in practice, simply
Exactly.
because the dynamics that you're studying are fundamentally different.
Yeah. And that would be a way to map out differences and potential weaknesses in some of the formal rules that we're trying to implement. Anyways, sorry, Aaron, I didn't mean to jump the line here.
Yeah,
Go
no
ahead.
worries. Just a quick, I want to make just a quick comment and then a question. And it's kind of related to this discussion. So the comment being, this is, I wanted to thank the authors because this has been a wonderful augmentation or development in the use of the IGT. I've been struggling to use the IGT in an interdisciplinary way that contributes to the work of my colleagues for several years now. And we were so inspired by your work that we pirated it immediately and have used it in a paper that we're presenting at MPSA next week. It's myself and Adam Weichman, who's on this call, and then several of other colleagues. And so one of the things that it was helpful for me to do was I've been trying to do process tracing in several cases where we're looking at water utility rates and what information goes into the calculations, the decision making for different actors as they decide whether or not to make longer term investments as a result of climate change, et cetera. And mapping out, creating the diagram of the institutionally kind of defined processes that are supposed to play out in this decision making really helped the process tracing. It gave us clear kind of institutional dependencies and voids that we identified that we were then able to go in and using process tracing, just map out how this process played out in a real case. And so we've done this in a couple cases so far. It's tempting to make the diagram much bigger, and then as a result of that, make the process trace a lot more complicated. So we've settled on a couple of simpler diagrams that I think capture just a single action situation. But it is a wonderful guidepost for pulling in some other sort of approaches to try to get at kind of that informal rules inform use. So I just want to make that comment. The quick question that I had was, I was just curious, it's a technical like software question. And maybe you can, if you wanted to share the software, we'd love to try to play around with it ourselves. But when you use that software, does it automatically just link sort of objects and conditions, or do you make that connection yourself using the software? Okay.
Yeah, so it's, as you may have already, so first of all, thank you so much for using it already, because I'm really curious to see how other people find it useful. So that's very nice of you, thanks. And maybe we can talk later on to see how to learn from your experiences. Yeah, so the point is that the object is part of, to make this connection between an object being the trigger for another institution still needs some human interpretation. So yes, we could do it through automatic text recognition, the stuff that Doug Rice is, for example, doing eventually. But right now, the arms, as I call them, so the institutions are drawn. The connection between the sanction and the institution is also automatically drawn, but the actual dotted lines between different objects are done by hand manually so far. Yeah. Okay. But that would definitely be a next step, because then it just removes a lot of the hassle.
Cool. Thank you.
Batoul, did you have something to add?
Not to this question specifically, but to the question that Michael had about how you could connect the action arenas. Like, I have an example from our paper that I can just show real quickly.
Go ahead.
So this was the action arena for the knowledge gathering phase. And basically, like, in this phase, a lot of like infrastructure owners, they don't make these models themselves for mapping the vulnerabilities, but they rather commission like the details of it, like they hire like an engineering firm or consultancy firm to construct these models for them. So in the case of, for example, the rail way up owner, ProRail, for example, he basically commissions these stress test specifications, and then a stress test is made. And when you then look at another, I have the bar of like Zoom on top of my screen so I can't see my tabs, but then when you look at like another action arena, like these objects, they basically are the inputs for another institutional statement. So the information
in a different action situation.
Yeah, in a different action situation. So this information from the stress test in a different action situation is used to define like in the discussion on, okay, what are the risks that you're gonna like focus on, because these stress tests show vulnerabilities, and that's your input basically to talk about, okay, what vulnerabilities you start to focus on. So that's one example from the paper, for example, in which these options they connect different action arenas.
So just one tiny note, we started with action arenas, but we decided to call them action situations. So we completely took out the action arena, if you're wondering why there's a duality of names. I think Adam had a question.
Sorry, Adam.
Yeah, and I know we're getting close to 10, so if, or I guess 10 Arizona time, so if we run out of time, definitely I can follow up via email. But first off, thank you so much for this work. It's been really helpful for, as Aaron said, for our team to try to think through bringing institutional statements together in complex networks of action situations. I know that this has also been applied in a dynamic modeling context, and as a modeler who wants to use this for institutional modeling, I was curious if you had any reflections on the relationship of network insights, so things like voids or dependencies that you've found, and what that means for the dynamics of the action situation. Because I guess one of the cool things about the network is that it allows you to see the sequencing involved and realize that these things aren't happening simultaneously, right? But that the dependencies create a sequencing, and perhaps in our case, we've been thinking through things like institutional friction, and how dependencies and voids might slow the process down. I wasn't sure if y'all had any reflections on that at this point. I know it's still kind of at a cool frontier.
Great question, Adam. Am I allowed to respond, or are we out of time?
Well, I can only say if anybody has to leave, thanks for attending, but anybody who wants to listen to the answer can stick around.
So Adam, I'm not using system dynamics modeling, as you know. I use agent-based modeling, and so far what I've been doing is actually then do the network analysis in combination and next to the agent-based model, and not use them, not feed one to the other. But that's still something yet to be done on my to-do list very shortly. So maybe one example of a finding that I could give you was that with an agent-based model, which was extremely extensive on flood risk management, we came to the conclusion that, for example, monitoring plays a huge role in the flood risk management situation in the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean. So it was really about the monitoring. But once we did the network analysis with the same data, actually, we could pinpoint with the network analysis that the problem was not really the monitoring. So the monitoring apparently seemed to be happening, but the institutional conflict that we saw was that the department that was supposed to be enforcing the sanctions was not doing its job. And that was just really clearly popping out of the diagram. It was amazing to see how it actually, played out in relation to the monitoring being important as an outcome of the agent-based model. next to simulation, so far it makes a lot of sense. It gives additional and complementary insights. But using it in an agent-based model about system dynamics, I don't know, because I only know how system dynamic models are built, but I don't have any expertise in it. With agent-based models, I think there are various ways of incorporating the findings into the model and vice versa, but that just is it's a presentation by itself, so I don't really have time to, people don't have time for me to go there, but we could have a separate meeting to discuss this for sure. I'd love to discuss that with you.
Great. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation, and thanks everybody for being so engaged and participating today. This concludes today's session. We'll see you again next month for our next presentation. Have a great day.
Thank you. Maybe just one thing, Tommy, if you could, maybe we can just test on your data with if it has many animate objects. Yeah, we can just.
Nice.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would be amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Nice. Bye.